employment problems, but that's changed, and that has impacted gay people in searching for marriage as a solution.
Yeah, I think that's the big picture. And in fact, I think that when you look at marriage equality activism, as I have pretty intensively for a period of almost 2 years, you can see that the message is one about how can we as a family gain access to those structures that allow people to manage life risks in a situation or a context where you can't rely on publics, you can't rely on the state.
Okay, talk about in the 70s and the Gay Liberation Alliance. They had this critique of family structures, traditional family structures. Mm-hmm. What did they want to see instead?
Yeah, there was very much a vision that gays and lesbians had something to offer that straights didn't understand. That there was a way of experiencing intimacy beyond the confines of marriage, and in some cases monogamy, that allowed you more freedom of expression, that was more egalitarian in terms of gender and class equalities. And so they saw the institution of marriage as a straight or heterosexist and even patriarchal institution that gay and lesbians themselves didn't belong in and had better options.
Yeah, actually, because that's when I grew up, and that is almost exactly the way I felt about marriage. It was like, wow, it is so male-dominated and so oriented toward assuring male authority that did not speak to me at all, particularly thinking in terms of growing older and being in a relationship with another man. It was like, well, those kind of values didn't speak to me at all. And so, yeah, that's where I was at then. Now, however, and this has changed over years, and I've been pretty much unconscious of it, where I really see great value in being married. Talk about that
Absolutely.
Change over time.
Sure, and that's not an illusion, right? It's not like you have become falsely conscious, of this institution. It's because you are at a point in your life, like many gays and lesbians, or our society is in a point of its history where having access to those mechanisms for managing life risks become ever more important. And we have become more attuned to risk as a population. We're very concerned. Many of the things that we do are about managing what could, the bad things that could happen, the disastrous results of something, and we very much have that mentality toward living life. So it's not surprising, and in fact, many of the same kinds of pressures that heterosexual couples face are the same pressures that gays and lesbians face, although for gays and lesbians this is often magnified by being a stigmatized population and also not having legal rights for your to your children, for example, parental rights.
Yeah. So on the back cover of your book, Wendy Brown states, the nuptial deal exposes the quest for marriage as a conservative risk management project. So that's what we've been talking about. One that leaves those outside its orbit even more vulnerable in the context of intensifying neoliberal inequalities. So this context of intensifying neoliberal inequalities, flush that out for us.
Yeah, as I understand it, these are things that you talk about on your program probably pretty regularly, which are efforts to take publicly funded projects, for example, and to siphon those off to private realms.
So publicly funded projects.
Right. So, for example, if you're thinking about sort of as a taxpayer, where is my money going, right? Instead of that money going into supporting public things like your post office or public hospitals, right? That we have been moving toward funneling those funds into private sources to manage those things for profits, right? For example. So that's what Wendy Brown is referring to when she's talking about this neoliberal project that has been siphoning off a sense of public and community resources to private hands, where profit becomes the logic rather than well-being of citizens, right? Which is the problem with that model. For example, with post offices, right? So when it becomes unprofitable, then there's no reason to have a post office in a small town. It's the same kind of logic where you base your governance and your social policy on the logic of profit rather than citizen well-being. And that's essentially what I'm talking about when it comes to marriage, except you're thinking about basing intimate decisions on, and family formations on, shifting that responsibility to individual couples rather than a larger commitment to the public.
Okay, all right. And so this is really kind of a process in which individuals have become itemized. Is that the right word? Insulated from each other, and insulated from the larger society and the state. And we're each told that we're responsible for all of our own well-being.
Right, right. And maybe to be more concrete, a way to look at it is through an example. So for a lot of the marriage equality activists that I talk with, they would discuss access to health insurance as one of the main reasons why they wanted to get married to their partner. Completely logical, right? It makes sense. Because if you have access to marriage, then you have access to your partner's health insurance. Now, you could look at that and say, well, in this way that we've structured health insurance, that's the smart decision to make. But what if your argument instead was, hey, we should have a system where you don't have to depend on just one person to get access to health insurance. It shouldn't be based on your relationship status, but it should really be based on the fact that you are a citizen of this country, or some other thing that is based on you being a human being, you know, rather than subscribing to this particular kind of intimate relationships. So one of the main conclusions of my book then is we need to uncouple the intimacy aspects of our relationships and marriage from the governing function of family institutions, because when we confuse the two of those, we no longer evaluate marriage as a practice of governance, but we evaluate it emotionally, and that makes it difficult for us to make good decisions, good social policy decisions.
Right, yeah. And from those in the 70s, they really wanted to do that.
Yes.
They really wanted to separate those two.
Yes.
Right, yeah. And so you've given us an example in terms of healthcare where moving away from this neoliberal institution of marriage could be done. So you've suggested something that I always advocate for, which would be like a single-payer healthcare system where everybody was covered, so that it wasn't dependent on who you were married to. Right. Okay. Can you give some other examples of ways that could happen?
Sure. Other examples of how marriage is integrated into this concept of managing risk. So
yeah, and then how do we recreate that so that they become separate again?
Oh, sure. So one example, another example besides health that I use a lot is in terms of unemployment, right? And this risk that you're going to, as many of us experience, because when you're middle class or working class in the United States, oftentimes you're one paycheck away from being in this kind of chaos situation, right? So what I look at is for gays and lesbians in the movement who were really trying to get access to marriage, part of it was about having that security of you have that other person that's there with you through sickness and in health, right? Who is going to be there if you lose your job. It's, you know, not just some commitment they made to you personally, but it's enforced through the state that they will be there for you as that support system, which, as I mentioned before, is very important when you have such a weak social safety net like we do in the United States. Now, one way of looking at that is to say that's why we need marriage, is so we can have access to this institution. Another way of looking at it is to say that is illogical and unfair, that we would ask one other individual to be that one person to provide a safety net, when we know that there are so many couples and so many Americans who are sort of on this brink. And we know that there isn't much of a social safety net for those folks. In this way, marriage becomes more of a compulsory institution where we feel like we have to enter it if we want to have that security, stability, and safety that goes along with that institution.
Yeah, so it really seems like marriage in and of itself doesn't have a lot of attractions, except that it provides us with the safety net.
That's part of the story. The other part of the story is we sentimentalize marriage as a population. And this is also true for gays and lesbians who grow up watching the same Disney movies, who think the same way about the power of actually having somebody say, you know, I now pronounce you. In the data that I collected in the interviews I did in my time with marriage activists, that was the thing that really sealed the deal for them. That's the difference for them. One of the big differences between domestic partnerships and marriage is to have that special seal that only the state can provide by saying, you are a prized couple. And this has implications for your family, the way your family treats you, but also for the way your society treats you. So for many of the activists I talked with, this meant that society now was telling them that they were just as legitimate, just as prized and important as straight people and their couples. One of my respondents talked about how when he had the opportunity to get married, because it's happened in pockets of the country, right? There's this brief period of time where gay people could marry.
Yeah.
He was one of these people. And he said when he actually heard that he was pronounced as spouse, that he felt for the first time that he was accepted as a gay man in America, right? That was the first time that he really felt like this country valued his humanity. So it's not just about dollars and cents. It's not just about gaining access to resources, but marriage, the reason why it's so powerful is because it has this symbolic effect. And it reverberates through our relationships with family, friends. I had respondents talk about how they would go to the farmer's market after they were married, and they would have complete strangers walk up to them and say, congratulations, can I give you a hug? That's marriage. That's a feeling that comes with it. And so one of the arguments I make is that's what makes it such a powerful form of governance, is because we don't see it as government. We see it as love. We see it as family.
So discuss this difference between government and governance.
Oh, that's a great question. So when you hear government, you might think of politicians, the state, or the subject of governing populations, right? When you think of governance, it's about a practice, a way of solving a series of problems that come with populations. So when I say governance, I'm taking it away from this idea that only states or governments do this kind of thing, but families do it too, right? We practice governance. And when we start to see families as ways of regulating or managing problems of the population, like illness and unemployment or poverty, then we can begin to evaluate, is this a democratic or fair way of governing? And my conclusion is no, it is not.
Okay. You know, when we first talked about doing this interview, I asked you to send me some questions, and so one of the questions you suggested was, can you explain why or how neoliberalism is relevant to marriage promotion?
Right, and actually that's what we've been talking about.
We have been,
in terms of marriage operating as a form of governance and not just a personal commitment or a kind of relationship, that marriage has been with us before neoliberalism, right? But as other aspects of our society has shifted with the increasing privatization, so has marriage. So has marriage shifted in terms of how it functions within this broader political economic climate. And at this point, it's operating as the last lifeboat, I argue, the last lifeboat in sort of a sea of drowning social safety nets. You know, you don't really have that much to hang on to if you're drowning. But marriage is one of those institutions that we uphold and say, you know, this is what you should be doing to have a stable life. You should get married, and you and your partner together, if you make good decisions, you can make it through life's inevitable ups and downs.
Right, yes, yeah. And of course, my partner and I have been together for 20 years, you know, so we have that informal.